Our guest speaker today is Gannett reporter Steve Orr, who will be talking to us about flooding and the financial impact of flood damage on the shores of Lake Ontario. Steve has written extensively on this topic, and it is our absolute privilege to host him. Please join me in welcoming Steve Orr.
Thank you. I can choose to either see you or see the notes I have, so the notes win. If you hold up any mocking signs, I won't be able to read them, so go ahead. So I'm talking about Lake Ontario, which I've written about ever since I got here many years ago, 37 almost. I've been a reporter here. The very first year I was here, I spent 3 months writing about nothing but Lake Ontario that summer and fall. And I've written about the flooding and the lake level issue over and over again ever since then. But last year was the worst flooding in the modern history of the lake. The lake may have gotten to a similar level back in the 19th century. I've heard talk around the Civil War maybe, but in the modern history this was by far the worst. The lake got higher than it had been. The lake stayed high for much longer than episodes in the past. And so this set the mark, whether it remains the mark, we'll see, but this set the mark in terms of the flooding, the extent of flooding. But the one thing that I find, as I thought about this, that's interesting about lakeshore flooding at Lake Ontario, in a way it sets apart from other natural disasters, is in a sense there's a political element to this, and there always has been, that you don't find when there's a hurricane or a bad tornado or an earthquake. You know, the government will step in afterwards and help people recover, help rebuild infrastructure, but there's not a lot of, there's no political element to it unless maybe there's some recriminations afterward about how quickly they responded or whatever. But with the lake, it's got a long history of people who live on the shore, in New York especially, being distrustful of the people who regulate the lake level. It's a sort of unique situation where there is some control over the lake level exercised at a dam on the St. Lawrence River that was put into service in 1960. There has been since that time plans under which the regulators release water or hold water back to try and keep the lake at a suitable level, to try and keep the river high enough but not too high for navigation, to support power plants, hydro plants on the river, and so on. So it's regulated. It's not unique, but very unusual in that sense. And so, but the people on the South Shore in New York have never trusted the regulators. It goes back decades. I mean, I think it's at least the third generation of property owners who are just not happy with the way regulation works. And when the water gets too high, typically they demand action from the regulators and get it, usually. And when there's flooding, I think there's an expectation that there's a belief that it's at least partly the fault of the regulators, and therefore there's an expectation that the government, the governments which support the regulators, should step in to compensate or to help recover. So it's in that sense an unusual situation, and there have been several times in the past after high water when the federal government and the U.S. side did step in 52 and 73, two high water episodes. There were millions of dollars in assistance given to shoreline property owners. In 93, there was another high water episode. I'm not sure there was any relief then. It wasn't quite as bad as the earlier two. But then this year, so the water got very high, and I think there was a lot of talk, a lot of hope that, well, somebody has to do something. We're getting damaged, our property's being ruined. Who's going to step in? Typically, after major disasters, that's FEMA. The federal agency has programs to provide assistance to individual residents and property owners. But in this case, the state officials, the Cuomo administration, knew what the guidelines were, and they knew that this flooding episode would not qualify for that type of FEMA aid, which is generally reserved for disasters where there's loss of life, there's a lot of injury, many people displaced from their homes, sort of the fabric of the society is disrupted in a long-term way. That didn't happen on the shoreline. So the state knew that there would be no FEMA individual aid coming to the South Shore. So the Cuomo administration stepped in. They've done this a couple of times before with their own sort of mini FEMA aid program. There have been a couple other flooding episodes that I've heard about where they've done it. In May, Governor Cuomo came here in Greece. It happened to be, as we found out later, the day when the lake was at an absolute peak level, and it started to go down slightly after he was here. Yeah, he scared it, and so it started to go down. So, but he announced that there would be some state aid available to property owners. He also took that opportunity, which surprised some people, to bash the regulators in a very blunt and nasty way. And there was a lot of blowback to that, back and forth with people in Canada and so on. But it seemed like he had made I mean, you could call it a political decision that he would step in and help the shoreline people, and he would sort of back them in their disagreements with the regulators. So that's what happened. He promised initially, I think it was $7 million. Then the legislature got involved. That escalated to $15 million for property shoreline residents, 15 more for businesses, 15 more for local governments. And then by the end of the year, when that applications for that program closed, and it was all done very hurriedly, and there was a fair amount of confusion at first, but the process worked, and in the end, 3,500 people applied for state aid, homeowners, and there's only 70, by our numbers, 71 parcels of land on the entire shoreline, hundreds of which are not developed, are just, public land or empty lots. So way more than half of the residential properties on the South Shore applied for state aid. And I know I talked to one of the entities administrating the aid. They were saying the average claim was $20,000 to $30,000. A lot of people were asking for help because their breakwalls, the revetments, the things they had on the shore to keep the water back, were just beaten and smashed by the water was so high. When you would get these storm episodes where you'd have bigger waves, it just destroyed many people's breakwalls. It was quite, I mean, I was out there a lot, and it was everywhere. People were just losing their protection. So most of that money was going to rebuild those. Some of it went to repair homes, some went to repair septic systems that had flooded out. I mean, there were a lot of different uses for it. But 3,500 people asked for it. If you do the math, the $15 million they had set aside was not, it was very clear to everybody it wouldn't be nearly enough to cover all the claims. So earlier this year, in January, the state, the Cuomo administration added $20 million more. So now we're up to $35 million in state money for residential property owners on the shore, which is still not going to be nearly enough. But, that's where we are now. As of this morning, I asked them, they said they committed $12.5 million. So about a third of the money that's set aside has been so far committed to individual property owners. About 650 claims have been paid, so that leaves a little under 3,000 to go. So as they warned, it'll be a long time before people get money. I think most of them are using, they've already spent the money, if they have it, to repair their home or their shoreline protection, and they'll get the state money to reimburse them, hopefully. But it's going to be a long road to hoe. So again, as I said, FEMA is the sort of, in many disasters, they're the source of that kind of funding. The state did apply for FEMA aid. The Trump administration, the president signed the disaster declaration in November, but it did not, as expected, did not provide any aid to individuals. It did provide aid to essentially to local governments that had spent money responding to the flooding, which they spent a lot, and also had damage to their infrastructure and property. And that led to one of my favorite stories in this whole saga, although frustrating, it was still funny, where the declaration came out, and I didn't notice it at first, but then somebody called me and they said, Monroe County's not in there. And I said, really? And I looked and I go, darn, it's not. So I went online and changed my story really fast and started to try and find out what happened to Monroe County, which is by far the most populous county on the South Shore. And they were not in the declaration. And it took like days, and it was a crazy mess, and I never could resolve what happened because I was told, well, Monroe was, their application to be part of this FEMA disaster declaration, they withdrew it, is what the state said. And I talked to the county, and they went apoplectic. And they said, we did not ever withdraw it. It wasn't in our hands. The state was doing it. We were just assisting. We weren't in a position to withdraw it. But it was withdrawn. I mean, there's no question. I saw documentation that it was like pulled out. And it got into this lovely argument between the state and the county where they each blamed the other for the fact that Monroe never didn't, and it came down to the state saying Monroe didn't do what they were supposed to do to get the application done, and Monroe saying the state didn't do what they were supposed to do. I mean, it's one of those stories, normally when you get these kerfuffles, if you ask enough questions, ask the right people, you can find out what really happened. Couldn't find out what happened in this case. It was frustrating, but it was also just kind of funny. And I knew, as did happen, that several months later, Monroe got added back in, or got added to the declaration, so they'll get several $1 million in reimbursement from the feds to pay for damage that county properties or that county and town properties sustained during the flooding. But that's the bulk of the FEMA money that's going to come here. I checked yesterday. Nobody knows how much it'll be. The preliminary estimate was $35 million. It could end up being 40 or 50. It could be less than that. And then there'll be some extra money from FEMA for what they call hazard mitigation, which is to kind of prepare for the next big storm, but it won't be enough to really prepare for the next big storm. So that's not going to be much money. The other FEMA thing I should mention, which is not a reimbursement program, but there is FEMA flood insurance. The way, if you don't live in a floodplain, you don't know. If you do, you know far more about it than I do. But if you live in a designated flood zone, you typically, at least if you still have financing out on your property, you are required to have flood insurance, which on the lakeshore, there are about 500 properties apparently in the flood zone. They're largely, that's in Monroe County, they're largely the west side, the Grace, Hamlin, Parma, which is sort of lower lying and is more susceptible to flooding than, say, Webster and Irondequoit. So those people most of them would have had to have insurance, not necessarily every one of them. A few $100 up to a few $1,000. I think most of those people probably filed claims. I mean, I was told that the damage from the high water and the waves should be covered by those policies, and so those people who I'm sure for years had cursed the fact that they were required to have insurance were, at least this year or last year, happy they had it. I don't have any update from FEMA as to how many have actually filed claims or what the total there is. I'm sure it's several $1 million just from those few hundred property owners that might have filed. The flood, as an aside, I talked to FEMA twice about this. I think the flood zone will be redrawn somewhat because this was unprecedented high water. I think we'll wait and see, but I mean, they have as much as said that they'll have to change the designated area. There may be more people on the shoreline that have to have flood insurance, but that program is always in flux, and who knows what will happen with it. It's always on the verge of going bust, and so who knows. But anyway, so that's FEMA. It was not a huge factor in this. And then the last source of money is the Army Corps of Engineers, which people kept asking them to do things, and they kept saying, we don't have the authority to do it. They have very limited authority to do anything in the middle of a crisis. They did a few little things, but that's it. They're involved because they kind of help. Well, they give permits for shoreline work. They have some jurisdiction over the lakeshore, and then they also give technical advice on the lake level regulation, and so they're kind of a party in the whole thing. But anyway, the one big thing, they under one program, they're spending a few $1 million to do some work along the shore in a couple places, but the state is now asking them to do a great big thing. This was last month, and 90 different places on the shoreline. This would be, I'm sure it'd be in the tens of millions of dollars. It's under another program that is forward-looking. It's not in response to the flooding last year, but the state is making the argument that, oh, the water's high again, and we'll probably have flooding again this spring, so therefore we're invoking this forward-looking program that the Corps has, under which they can come in and put up sort of emergency bulwarks or other protection on the shoreline. And this was done. There's a precedent for this in 1973 that did a bunch of that stuff around here and elsewhere in the Great Lakes because the water was really high and they thought there would be flooding, and there in fact was. And a lot of that stuff, which was supposed to be temporary, remained until this year. I mean, people would point out when I go up there and they said, oh, the Corps put that in the 70s. And most of that was broken up and destroyed last year, but it did last a long time. So that they're coming in, they're asked to come in, but the Corps has to agree with the Cuomo administration's claim that flooding, another round of flooding, is inevitable. And I personally don't know that that's a sustainable argument, but it'll be up to the Corps to decide if it is. If they wait long enough, we'll know, because by spring we'll know if there's going to be flooding again or not, probably. So if you add all this up, I mean, nobody has yet added up the cost of this flooding. It may be done someday officially. If I had to guess, well, I do have to guess right now, I'm going to say somewhere in the $200 to $250 million range, just based on what the state's going to pay, based on what the feds are going to pay the municipalities. I mean, it's somewhere in that ballpark. Certainly the highest dollar amount on the shoreline for flooding. I mean, this is not counting what happened in Canada. On the Canadian side of the lake, they had same water we did, probably somewhat less damage because they're somewhat less likely to have homes really low to the water, but there are certainly plenty of them, and there was damage. And then, of course, the up or down the river in St. Lawrence around Montreal, where all of our Lake Ontario water goes, they had awful flooding. It was just terrible. It was like the worst flooding in decades. And the cost there is hundreds of millions, $1 billion, I don't even know. So, I mean, that's connected. It's not exactly the same thing, but it's, it's our water that goes there. So, add the Canadian side in of just the lake, maybe another couple $100 million. So it's, it was compared to the hurricanes that hit last year in Texas, Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, or Florida, this was nothing. But compared to what's happened around here, this was definitely the worst. I think the most costly anyway. But as I wrote, it's an odd kind of disaster because it doesn't happen like an earthquake in 10 minutes, or like a tornado in 10 minutes, or like a hurricane a day or two. It happened over 3 or 4 months, and it happened very slowly. And it would happen in little waves. The water would get high, and then there'd be a little storm, and the water would get pushed over everybody's break wall, and they'd all run around with sandbags and pumping their basements out. And then the waves would go away, and then they'd take a breather, and then it would happen again. So it was a slow motion kind of disaster. And it was just very different in that sense, and in the sense that, I think there was this sort of political element to it that did sort of encourage the state to step in and provide aid. And if they hadn't done that, boy, there'd be people just screaming like crazy up on the shoreline. And I'm sure there'd be lawsuits filed and God knows what. But that didn't happen. The state stepped in. So $250 million, take it or leave it, something like that. And that's what I have to say about the cost of the lake flooding. The only other thing I'll mention, because somebody will probably ask, is it going to happen again? Don't know. As we wrote right around the end of the last year, start of this year, there is this new plan that I'm sure somebody will ask a question about to regulate the lake. Went into effect a year ago in January. This is the first this was the first winter and now going into the first spring where that plan has been in effect. The one thing, I've written about this plan so many freaking times, and I realized I didn't understand exactly what they meant. They had always said, oh yeah, the water will be higher a little bit. And so we kept writing that, and I finally said, you know, I don't get it. Like, what's the real difference? And it took several weeks to get the regulators to finally connect me with somebody that explained. And the biggest difference they articulated is, under the new plan, the water would be kept higher in the winter. That's the one discernible big difference. Normally, the lake, if you follow, there's a cycle like every lake, or many lakes anyway, where it peaks in the spring, goes down in the summer, continues down in the fall, stays down in the winter, and then starts back up in late winter as snow starts to melt, and then goes, peaks again in the spring. So normally they would allow the lake to get low in the winter, to just go down, and because there was no navigation, the seaways closed, so they didn't need to keep a lot of, anyway, so they just let it get lower in the winter. The new plan wants it higher, about a foot higher. That's part of the sort of elements of the plan to help the ecosystem. And I won't even try and explain how, but it was intentional. So they said, yeah, we'll keep it about a foot higher. And sure enough, it has been since December anyway, a foot higher than the long-term average. And I check it like every week or so, and it's still a foot. I checked it yesterday. It's like almost exactly a foot. And as we wrote, that's fine. I understand there are reasons they do it, but it does reduce the margin of error in the spring. Because in the spring you don't, obviously there's a lot of snow that melts, and there's often in the spring a lot of rain. And if you get too much melting snow and too much rain, like last year for instance, then the lake gets really high very quickly, and there's, and then you can have a flood. So they're a foot closer to that point than they have ever been than they're accustomed to being in the past. Put it that way. Does that mean it's going to flood? No. But you keep watching, and they have been releasing water through that dam at a record pace because there's been a lot of precipitation over the winter. We've had a lot of snow, then we've had these warm periods where the snow melted. We've had rain, and so we've gotten a huge amount of water coming into the lake, much more than normal, I think, in winter. And they've been releasing as much water as they've ever released before or more through the dam for this time of year. I saw the curve the other day. It's like crazy high what they're letting out of the lake, but it's not really doing much because so much is coming in. You just walk over there, over the river, or, over the bridge over the river, and it's raging like it does in April and May. The water, the lakes, the rivers are all really high. So what's going to happen? I don't know. I mean, I looked at the long-term, or the month, next couple of months, the projection for precipitation, and which may or may not really be very accurate, but it's all there is. Said no, below average precipitation. So if that happens, the lake will be fine. The water will go down. The plan is that the water will gradually go down to normal, and that by late spring it'll be at normal, or what people are accustomed to for that time of year. But if it rains like last year, then it'll flood again, and then people will blame the regulators, and this time they'll have some justification, I think. But we'll see. We'll meet again in a couple months and see what happened. Anyway, that's what I have to say. If there's any questions, I'll put my glasses on so I can read the expressions on your faces.